Hi, this is Vivian Vande Velde. Welcome to my house where there is construction going on right across the street from us. So if you hear some loud thumps, that's what's going on. I am here to read to you from Ghost of a Hanged Man, a book that was published by Marshall Cavendish. It's been out of print for a long time, so you probably won't have a chance to read it, so I'm hoping that you are enjoying listening to it. I am reading to you chapter 9, called Mr. Chetwynd. Not having gotten much sleep, I was still in bed when Deputy Emmett Sanders came banging at our door early next morning. By the time I was dressed, he was gone. "What is it?" I asked Pa. Pa was sitting at the kitchen table, pulling on his boots. "Ira Chetwynd died during the night," he said. "Murdered?" I asked, having Jake Barnett on my mind. Pa snorted. "More like 50 years of eating too much, drinking too much, and taking everything too seriously." I remembered how red in the face he'd been about me and Annabelle and Elijah being underfoot at the cemetery. Mr. Chetwynd was always red in the face. Pa said he'd hired the Kingsfield boys to paint his house once the rain stopped. They came knocking on his door first thing in the morning. No answer, but they got to work anyway, which is a surprise no matter how you look at it, considering the Kingsfields. But anyway, they started scraping the old paint from around the windows, and when they got to his bedroom window, they looked in, and there he was, lying in bed with his eyes wide open. Doc Fitzgerald says his heart probably gave out during his sleep. "Bad night all around," I said. Pa looked at me real stern. "A man dying is nothing to make mock of, Ben." He was on his feet before I had a chance to say that wasn't my intent. Still, I wasn't the only one to think of murder. Elijah Quinn came over to ask if Annabelle and I thought Jake Barnett had something to do with Mr. Chetwynd's sudden death, which did more to convince me he hadn't than anything Pa or Doc Fitzgerald could have said. But adults were talking about it, too. I'd gone to Pickett's general store, partly with a craving to buy a penny pickle from the barrel, but also to get away from Annabelle and Elijah. A lot of other people were out and about too, celebrating the good weather, and several of them were gathered in Pickett's before me. "Anybody else notice," somebody pointed out just as I came in, "that with Ira Chetwynd being a widower who never had any children, and with Emmett Sanders being both real young and an orphan, Sheriff Springer is the only one of the townsfolk Jake threatened who has any family?" Suddenly that pickle craving just dried up and blew away. "What about Judge Wade?" someone asked. "Is he married?" Nobody knew. Nobody thought so, but nobody knew. Judge Wade was a circuit judge, traveling from town to town to those places that weren't big enough to have their own regular courts, so Pa was probably the only one who knew him real well, and Pa wasn't one to hang around a general store gossiping. "The judge is due in tonight," one woman said. "I'll ask Betsy Montgomery if she can't find some way to ask him." Just about then somebody noticed me in the crowd, and the conversation quickly shifted to the weather, and what a relief it was that the rain had finally stopped, despite, Mr. Pickett said, "that gypsy woman's curse." "It wasn't a curse," I wanted to tell him. "You never thought it was a curse before." But I figured if I said such a thing, I'd get swatted and told to mind my manners to my elders, and they still would believe what they wanted to believe. So I said nothing. But the only interesting thing I heard after everybody finished complaining about the Tinkers was the estimate that it would probably be at least another 2 days before the ground dried out enough to start reburying the unearthed coffins. That evening, after supper, Annabelle suddenly asked Pa, "Is it all right if I sleep in your room tonight?" Pa looked up at her with a scowl, which was more surprise than annoyance. "No," he said. "Then may I sleep in Ben's room?" "No," Pa said again. "Why are you asking?" "No reason," Annabelle said with a shrug. Naturally, Pa figured I was to blame. "Have you been telling tales to scare your sister?" "No, sir," I assured him. "Out with it, girl," Pa commanded. Annabelle shuffled her feet. "Elijah Quinn said," and I could hear Pa sigh just at that little bit, "that nighttime is when ghosts are strongest. And that's how Jake Barnett was able to get at Mr. Chetwynd and scare him to death. Elijah says that's what stopped Mr. Chetwynd's heart." Pa rested his face in his hand and shook his head. "There's no such thing as ghosts, Annie," he said, "and you're too old to be believing in them, or to be sleeping in other people's rooms." "Yes, Pa," she mumbled. Pa looked at her for a long couple of seconds, then reached over to the mantelpiece and took down a photograph of him and Mamma and me when I was 4 years old, and Annabelle when she was too young to walk or talk or listen to Elijah Quinn. Annabelle's foot was blurred in the picture because she'd been too young to understand when the photographer said we had to hold still. "Would you feel better if you had this up in your room with you?" Pa asked. "If you knew Mamma was watching over you?" Annabelle brightened up. She nodded vigorously and took the picture. "Good night, Pa," she said, giving him a big hug and kiss. I gave Pa a look behind Annabelle's back, which was supposed to say that I thought Annabelle was a baby. But if there had been a second picture of Mamma, I wouldn't have said no to having that in my room. I hope you enjoyed Ghost of a Hanged Man, Chapter 9, and that you'll tune in tomorrow. And meanwhile, stay safe and be kind.